One group that they were very important for are individuals that are referred to as the Cappadocians. These are a set of 3 theologians and bishops from the region of Cappadocia. They're very important Eastern theologians and shape a lot of Eastern Orthodoxy in some very important ways. And Ferguson even calls them the representative of the Christianization of classical culture, this attempt to kind of make it acceptable or use the skills of them. The first of these 3 Cappadocians is a man named Basil of Caesarea, or Basil the Great, who had trained as a rhetorician and a lawyer, even though Christian, and through the example of his sister Macrina, as well as her prodding him, he actually kind of turns away from that aspect and goes to Egypt. And in Egypt, he learns the monastic life. And this is kind of the direction that he decides to go, because monasticism really starts off in Egypt, spreads through the east, and eventually through the west. After spending some time in Egypt, he will return back and eventually become Bishop of Caesarea. He will start a variety of monastic communities like his sister had been doing, and actually set up a rule for how those communities should be organized. And this rule is actually still forms the foundation for a lot of monasticism used in Greek Orthodoxy. And so for almost 2,000 years, it's been very influential. The second of the Cappadocians is a man named Gregory of Nyssa. He is the younger brother of Basil of Caesarea and Macrina, but doesn't have the desire like Basil does to be out in the spotlight. So he's much more humble than Basil is. He's much more, kind of wanting to stay out of the limelight, so to speak. He too studies rhetoric, eventually teaching rhetoric for a while. He is married, evidently, but his wife will die, and that kind of marks a change that he begins to experience. And like his brother and sister, decides to go the monastic route. And really, a lot of what this Gregory is interested in is just a simple, quiet love. He wants to be given the time to contemplate, spend time contemplating God, and so he's much more mystical than his brother and sister. But his older brother Basil will eventually convince him to become bishop of the city of Nyssa. There he will write and preach against the Arians, but the contemplative life is always the thing that's kind of drawing Gregory. And so he's not really interested in paying too much attention to the finances, some of the other administrative types of tasks, and so he's removed from his position as bishop for a while because he's kind of careless with the church funds. It's not like he's doing anything corrupt, it's just he's not paying attention to them. He's not really kind of focusing on how they're being used. So he'll be removed, but then we'll come back. And eventually will become advisor to the Emperor Theodosius. The third of the Cappadocians is another man named Gregory of Nazianzus. His father was Bishop of Nazianzus, and his family was rather wealthy, so he was well off, and had also gone through this interest in oratory and rhetoric. And it's in the context of that he meets Basil. And so that's kind of how he gets brought into that. And this Gregory becomes a rather gifted orator, but much like Basil encouraged his brother to become a bishop, he wants his friend Gregory to become bishop as well. But Gregory of Nazianzus feels that's not really something he's interested in, and feels that Basil's getting too pushy about it, and eventually it causes a rift between the two of them. It really affects their relationship. He, like Gregory of Nyssa, wants a contemplative life. He doesn't want to be active in church leadership. Unfortunately, they will not reconcile before Basil's death. But after Basil passes away, Gregory of Nazianzus becomes much more active and becomes a champion of orthodoxy against the Arians especially. Right? And so some people suggest that maybe guilt or something like this that kind of brings him now, I need to be more active than what he had been before. We'll say more about the Cappadocians later, because not only are they representative of this interest in classical learning by Christians, they are also very important in some discussions about the Trinity, and trying to lay out how is God both three and one. So we'll come back to them later on. Another individual who was very interested in classical learning and used it quite effectively was a man named John. Born somewhere in around the middle part of the 4th century, 347 is sometimes the date given. He's born in Antioch, and he too will study rhetoric. But he will study with a pagan teacher, and this pagan teacher thought very highly of John's rhetorical skills, but was very disappointed that he was a Christian. And kind of like, you could have done these marvelous things if you hadn't been a Christian with rhetoric. He does, however, hold off baptism until his early adulthood, baptized somewhere between the age of 18 and 20. His mother had been very influential in his life as a Christian. And when he is baptized, John decides that he wants to live a monastic life. But his mother doesn't want him to leave. And so she doesn't want him to go off somewhere and be a monastic. So they decide to convert their house into a monastery. And she's a widow, he's not married at the time. But after she passes away, he decides to continue to practice monasticism, eventually going out in the wilderness, kind of separating himself off, choosing a solitary route of monasticism instead of the monastic community. Eventually, though, he will return to Antioch, will become a deacon and then a priest, and becomes very well known for his preaching and his rhetorical skills in preaching, so much so that it earns him the name Chrysostom, Golden Mouth. And so he's well known for his ability. And one of the things that Chrysostom did quite frequently was to take a biblical book and throughout his sermons go from one text to the next. Right? And each sermon would be kind of an expository sermon, many of which are there's still remnants of, that we still have copies of. And just kind of the first part of the sermon would be essentially working through describing, what's going on in this passage, and then he would come back for the application. So very expository type of preaching, which is really interesting because with these sermons being recorded, we have a lot of them, and so he talks about a lot of biblical books. Gives us insight into how some early Christians thought of these texts, what issues they saw in these texts, how they interpreted them. And sometimes it's really important type of literature. So, for example, Chrysostom works his way through the book of Acts. It is the last commentary on Acts written for 1,000 years. And so for 1,000 years, there isn't commentaries on Acts in any substantial type of way. So Chrysostom really gives us a good look into, especially in the 4th century, the book of Acts. Eventually, this priest, this well-known preacher, will become Bishop of Constantinople. And toward the end of the 4th century, very prestigious position at the time. But John is not swayed by that, right? You could see how somebody could, come into this position of power and really get to enjoying the power, enjoying the luxury, etc. But when he gets to Constantinople, he really becomes concerned about the moral situation he finds in the town. Not just in Constantinople, but among the clergy, among the priests. and the deacons and the presbyters, who are living immoral lives. Many of whom are living immoral lives. And so he starts trying to make some reforms. He starts preaching other, reforms to other groups. The rich become a very important target for Chrysostom, and that angers the empress because she feels he's talking about her, and he probably was. But there's this kind of feeling she has that any time she's in a sermon listening to Chrysostom preach, that everybody's looking at her like, are you listening to this? Right? That she feels like the message is directed to her. And so she wants to get rid of John. Right? It's time for him to go. And so she works with the Bishop of Alexandria, who doesn't like John either. And John is accused of a variety of false charges and removed from being bishop. Well, the people of the town, bishops of nearby towns, don't like this, and they almost riot because of it. An earthquake will happen shortly after he's removed from his post, and many people assume that it's God's expression of divine judgment. Right? This is a sign that John needs to be brought back. So a few months later, shortly after that, John is called back. A few months after that, he's back in exile, and he's kicked back out. This time, a riot does happen. But followers and supporters of John were banished. Some of them were even tortured. And so this time he is not brought back. He begins writing about his situation from exile and gains support from a variety of people, including the Bishop of Rome. They appeal to the emperor, reverse this ban, reverse this exile you've given. But the emperor does not. In fact, he moves John further away, out to the Black Sea. John will get very ill on those travels. The soldiers basically don't care too much about him because he's an enemy of the emperor, and so there's no reason to really be concerned about his health. And so he will get very ill during that travel and eventually die because of it. The last individual I want to bring to your attention, as far as in the context of this issue of learning and classical learning in Christianity, is a man we've already talked about, Jerome. Jerome was born probably around 345 in northern Italy. Baptized at the age of 19, he will go to Rome and study classics and philosophy. And it's during his early adulthood, when he's traveling in Antioch, he gets ill, and that's when he has that dream where the judge says to him, "No, you're Cicerone, not a Christian." And so it's that which will change his focus. Right? And so he begins studying Scripture and other Christian literature. But he's also obsessed with sex. And so he's very concerned about the temptations he's experiencing with sex. And so he just decides, I'm going to turn to the monastic life. I'm going to completely separate myself from this, and it's going to take care of it. It doesn't. Right? And so he's still plagued with this. But he engages in all sorts of things like letting his hair grow long, not bathing. The fellow monks don't like him, and so eventually he'll leave, and he'll go back to Antioch. But while he's living the monastic life, he begins to study Hebrew. I guess evidently he thought that if he studies Hebrew, puts all of his effort into Hebrew, he won't have the sexual temptation anymore. So Hebrew is the answer to contemporary marital problems. He'll come back to Antioch. He'll be ordained a presbyter. Eventually will move and become a secretary to the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome, learning of his skills with language, especially Hebrew, encourages him to develop a new Latin translation. The feeling was that the translations in Latin of the Bible up to this point had been very literal, which were sometimes made it a little awkward for people to understand what the text meant. And so Jerome is kind of tasked with this job of translating Bible into Latin anew. And he will develop a translation of the Psalms and the New Testament. After the Bishop of Rome dies, he will eventually move to Jerusalem, Palestine, return to the monastic life, create a variety of monastic houses, but continue working on his translation. His translation of the Bible will become known as the Vulgate, suggesting that it is for the common people, right? Vulgar in Latin refers to things that are common, not necessarily things that are immoral, although certainly that's how we use it today. Instead of translating from the Greek Septuagint, as a lot of the previous Latin translations have done, he works from the Hebrew, especially for the Old Testament. Much like any other modern translation, when his version of the Vulgate comes out, a lot of people don't like it because it changed some things about the old Latin translation that people really loved. So even back in the 4th century, people had problems with new translations, right? They get so attached to the old one. And so even though there were problems with the old one, they still loved some of the things about the old one. The Vulgate, however, will essentially become the version of the Bible for that western part of the empire as Christianity develops into Catholicism. So people will eventually stop looking at the Greek and Hebrew texts, and really, of course, as Latin kind of dies off, they'll even stop reading the Bible at all. Questions about any of the individuals we've been talking about here with respect to classical learning and philosophy? While we spoke about the role of the government and the church, there, of course, is also the question of what role does the church have in government. We talked about Ambrose, divine Theodosius, calling him to account for his actions. Some bishops believed that they had authority over the emperor, but the religious sphere is above the state. Gregory of Nyssa, of course, becomes an advisor to Theodosius, becomes an ambassador. The Arian emperor Valens comes to Caesarea while Basil is the bishop there. And he comes expecting this great reception, and Basil essentially just makes him wait before he will actually come out to him and kind of welcome him. Right? So there's these attempts to try and show the emperor where true power lies. What we see in other aspects of culture is that, and we talked a little bit about this on Tuesday, right? As Christians come into power, they persecuted the pagans that had been persecuting them when they didn't have power. Jews as well also found themselves persecuted by these Christian officials as well. Ambrose, for example, called Jews mindless and called Judaism superstition and the evil Jewish fire. We, of course, talked about how he responded when Theodosius said we need to rebuild this synagogue. John Chrysostom called the Jews good for nothing. And there are some accounts of some rulers bringing Jews before them at the time of Easter and having them beaten for their, having a Jew brought before them and beaten because of their role in the crucifixion. And so there's this kind of wild swing. Christianity kind of starts as a movement within Judaism. It has a lot of Jews. Now it's kind of transferred into a Gentile religion, fully Gentile religion, very few Jews. And then one that is often persecutorial to Jews.